What's in the world? What kind of things compose existence, all reality? I wonder all the time. Here's the crux of the question. Is the natural physical world all there is? Or is there something more? Anything more? Like a supernatural, non-physical existence of some kind? Nothing's more important for ultimate meaning or purpose. Most scientists are naturalists. Most people are supernaturalists. I was trained in science, so I should be a naturalist. I should reject anything non-physical. I have a secret. I'm not so sure. Are there things not physical? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. I'm after non-physical stuff. See if anything not material exists. Others start with religion, mysticism, ESP. Not me. I start by categorizing existence. Are there different categories? How many categories? Could one category be non-physical? I ask a tough-minded philosopher known for his unconventional ideas, particularly about consciousness, Colin McGinn.
Colin, how do we exhaust, totally exhaust under all possible conditions, all of reality, no matter what it will be? How many categories of things do we need?
Well, traditionally, you need three very big categories: the physical, the mental, and the abstract. Some people think you need an extra category for the divine, but then again, others think that that can be explained in terms of the mental, or the mental can be explained in terms of the divine. For example, you think that the soul participates in the divine, so you don't really need an extra level. You can make do with three categories.
And the mental would be a broad mental to the consciousness, and that's a God consciousness.
Right, exactly. Right. So that would include the spiritual in the broadest sense.
So if there is a spiritual, you would have it in mental, or no spiritual, mental, still a real category.
Right. But I'm a little bit suspicious of the three categories myself, because I'm not clear that the terms that are used to define the categories themselves are well defined. So let's take the category of the material. Is there a single unitary definition of the material? Well, it's not so clear that everything that physics talks about is of the same ontological type. So, for example, in physics we have the difference between particles and fields, and fields are very different from particles. So it looks like in physics we've got two ontological types, not just one. And they're both called material, but now it becomes a bit doubtful why they're both called material, since they're so different from each other.
So maybe it's even a mistake of having both of those within the same category.
Exactly. Oh. Now the same point can be made about the mental. Within the mental realm, again, there is controversy about what belongs there. There's a great contrast between the phenomenal experience, like having a sensation or an emotion, on the one hand, and on the other hand, cognitive phenomena. And then on the third hand, you've got volitional phenomena like acts of will, decisions and so on. It's not so clear. Much the same can be said about the so-called realm of the abstract. We've got numbers there, but we've also got propositions. Have we got points in space, infinitesimal points in space? Maybe they belong there, maybe they don't. So if you start pursuing that line of thought, you start to think that we need more categories than that. And it's not sufficient to have just the mental, the physical, and the abstract.
Scientists today would say it's all ancient metaphysics, and that there is only a physical world. It has different parts of it. There may be fields and forces and different things within the physical world, but everything else is just accidental constructs of the human mind, which itself is just an accidental result of the random fluctuations of evolution. And that's it.
Yeah.
And all of this conversation is really not worth very much.
Interestingly enough, in the history of physics, there was that controversy about fields themselves, because when particles were the order of the day and there was nothing else and there was just mechanics and particles and contact causation, fields were mysterious, and people said we don't need fields. Later, when fields became inescapable, there was the converse move. Let's do away with the particles. They're just fields of force and there are gradients of energy, and that's really all there is. But all of this is metaphysics. So the physicists were doing metaphysics whether they liked it or not, and there wasn't much of an alternative. And when they make claims such as everything else is a mental construct. That's metaphysics, because what they're claiming is the mental and the abstract world are just fictions.
Right.
So they're fictionalists.
But that itself is a metaphysical
It's a piece
claim.
of metaphysics.
Yeah.
And among metaphysicians today, there are those who are fictionalists about the abstract world. There's nothing more to the world than the physical world is already a metaphysical claim. Science doesn't establish that. No experiment has ever shown that to be the case. All of that's metaphysics.
Right.
And if it's metaphysics, it should be debated as metaphysics. And that's what they don't seem to realize, that they're engaged in the very thing that they are trying to dismiss.
But you're telling me that for your understanding of all reality, you need to multiply categories.
Yes, I'm a pluralist.
You're a pluralist.
I'm an ontological pluralist. There are many categories. And not just the ones we've talked about so far. We haven't talked about value yet. So moral value and aesthetic value. I think we need another category for value.
Doesn't this make your all there is really confused?
Well, there's a task left for metaphysics in all of this, which is, all right, you've got all these different categories. How are they related to each other? If they were related in a confused way to each other, then the universe would be confusing. Maybe the world universe is confusing, but we haven't settled that yet by saying there are many categories. So there can be relations of dependence of one category on another. So to me, traditional metaphysics in the three parts is quite questionable.
So many categories of existence. Why doesn't that feel right? If categories are constructs of the human mind, not out there in reality, fine. I have no problem with multiple categories. But if categories reflect the deep structure of the external world, existing in reality, independent of human invention, then I do have a problem with multiple categories. If I were the big guy in charge, I'd create all reality simple, and out of simplicity would come complexity, I think. How to discern simple categories of existence? Humanity's traditional way is through religion. Two simple categories. Religion provides God, a non-physical transcendent being in a radically different category, and God provides everything else. I visit Christian philosopher J.P. Moreland.
JP, I'm going to ask you a very strange question. What things really exist? Now, to many people, that sounds ridiculous. But why is this an important question?
Oh, Robert, it's a very important question. And it's actually pretty commonsensical why it's important. Here it is. People should live their lives according to reality and not fantasy. I mean, we all want to try to live our lives according to what's actually real. Now, reality is what you bump up against when your beliefs are false. And I think that one's answer to that question is going to shape an awful lot of how they approach life.
Okay, so the physical world we got. Now, what else we got?
Well, we have to stop for a minute and ask the question, what is it for something to exist? I think something exists if it actually has attributes or properties. So, for example, if there really is such a thing as a number 2, there has to be at least one attribute it really has, say the property of being even. If there were such things as unicorns, there would have to be creatures that had the attribute of being a one-horned horse.
Not the concept of it, but the actual.
Yeah, because the concept of a unicorn is not something you can ride. It's in my mind. You could ride a unicorn if it existed. So the concept of a unicorn doesn't have the property of being a horned horse. It is about something that has the property of being a horned horse if it exists. So when we ask, does something exist or not, we're asking, is there a range of objects that actually have certain attributes? Now, you ask me, what do I think exists? I think that there is a physical cosmos that exists in space and time. I do not believe the future exists. I do not believe the past exists. I think only the present exists. The future will exist, and the past did exist. I also believe that there is an abstract realm outside of space and time where things called abstract objects or universals exist. Things like numbers, the laws of logic, the laws of mathematics are real. They would be moral values, they would be numbers, laws of logic, propositions, which are the contents of thoughts, like the proposition snow is white can be communicated in Schnee ist weiß or snow is white. Those are two sentences that express the same proposition. Propositions can't be seen, touched, tasted, smelled, or heard. They can be in minds, but they're abstract objects. I also believe there's a God. I believe there is considerable evidence for the existence of angels and demons. I believe these beings are real.
Do you see, taking your last category, God and the angels and demons as part of the same sort of spiritual aura realm or the immaterial realm? Do they inhabit that separate orb or plane?
Abstract objects like moral values do not exist in space and time. Angels and demons exist in time and are capable of influencing things at places in space. So they're persons, but they're not humans. They're persons that have consciousness. They are capable of thinking and feeling and being aware of things. They're capable of acting, but they don't have bodies, and I believe they're real. I have the immaterial world as a category. There's the abstract immaterial world and the non-abstract.
Okay.
The abstract immaterial world includes Platonic forms, moral values. The non-abstract material world, persons including God.
Okay.
Even if God is not in space and time, he's still not an abstract form. He's an individual person. And angels are finite persons. Human beings are finite persons with bodies.
As a Christian and a philosopher, JP has two big categories: material and immaterial worlds. JP's immaterial world, the interesting one, contains abstract objects like numbers and moral values, and immaterial, non-abstract objects like God, angels and demons, and souls. This is religious thinking, obviously. While most philosophers believe that abstract objects, numbers, exist, only a minority go for immaterial, non-abstract objects, God. No surprise that the latter are mostly religious believers. Religion alone, without some faith-based conviction, finds no evidence for immaterial, non-abstract objects, God or angels or souls. What about the vast expanse of human belief in things not material? I apologize. But as much as I hope that non-material things do exist, I put little stock in human belief. Yet, I should wrench myself out of a Western analytic orientation. I meet the renowned Buddhist scholar Ananda Guruge. Ananda, from a Buddhist point of view, what are the things of reality?
When we study the subject, is presented under four headings, and these are the four things that exist. Chitta is consciousness. In the emphasis that Buddhism gives to consciousness, Chitta, consciousness, is identified as one of the most important, the first thing that exists. Chaitasika or Chetasika means the abstract mental factors, both the good and the bad. We have the emotions that are kindness and sympathy and compassion and pity and sympathetic joy, as well as anger, malice and avarice and greed. All these are abstract mental factors, and they are again studied as another set of things to be recognized as existing and studied. Third is called Rupa, which is form, and form goes in every aspect, this life as well as the other lives. Buddha's concept of the universe was in the plural. In Buddhism, we talk not of one universe, we talk of universes, unending and without a limit. And they are always arising, existing, decaying, and disappearing. And we talk in terms of worlds that are coming into existence today and disappearing tomorrow. There are 31 possible existences that we recognize, started with the hells to invisible hungry ghosts and demons and deities, the gods, the people in the 6 kinds of heavens, those in the higher states of mental existence, they say there are 4 worlds in which the mind exists without a body, or consciousness exists without a body.
That's the highest levels.
That's the highest level. And Nibbana. Outside all this is that state of complete cessation of suffering which the Buddha presented as the explanation of his path.
That's the word we know as nirvana.
Nirvana. So this composes the whole the universe and or universes, and there is nothing that is excluded.
I am such a novice at Buddhism, but how Buddhism structures existence is not how I do it. But so what? Why should my way be the right way? Is there a right way? Or are categories of existence arbitrary? Am I trying to structure reality to support my own hopes? I hope I'm not so foolish. I do need to include all possibilities. Maybe our universe is a fake. Maybe it's all a simulation. I go to MIT to visit the legendary pioneer of artificial intelligence, Marvin Minsky.
It's hard to know what to do with the word exist, because after a career in computer science, we know how to make simulated worlds, and we wonder what it's like to be in them. I think everyone by now has seen computer games where these people come running out and you negotiate with them. There are some social games where you have some goals and some of the other creatures have goals and you make deals with them. Now, you could ask, do the people in these simulated computer games exist? And if you were to look inside, you'd find that usually they don't have any minds at all. But in some of the games that have been developed recently, each of the characters has some features, some characteristics, and they may have some goal. Well, I think in the next 20 years, the characters in the computer games are going to get more and more complicated. And eventually they may have several levels of cognitive activities. They may have remember what they've done and not repeat it, and they may have a sense of their own identity, and they might think about, should I do this? No, because I don't have the ability to carry out that plan. So now you could ask, do those people exist? And you could say, no, they're just simulated in a program. But eventually, maybe they'll have programs as large as those in our own human brains, and those processes do everything that we can do. So now you could ask, for all we know, you and I don't exist in a physical sense. We're just being simulated by a fairly big computer somewhere. And all these lights and cameras are being simulated by a program. So you can't ever know that you exist. You might be a simulation. It's the process itself that's the real thing, and it doesn't have to exist in any ordinary sense. It's just possible.
So you're defining real as possible.
Anything
possible is real, but there's no independent sense of reality.
Yeah, so I wouldn't use the word real at all. I think it's obsolete and unnecessary. However, it makes sense to talk about what's happening in this universe, which is the one that we're stuck in.
So to ask the question, what stuff is real, you can't even answer that question because...
No, I'd say, to say that this button is real is to say it's in this universe that we're in. To say that the universe is real makes no sense at all. It's just possible.
Okay, Marvin, maybe we couldn't tell if our universe were real or simulated. But somewhere, there would have to be a real, unsimulated, bedrock reality universe. Maybe the real question is simple. Is existence only physical? Then, for me, the axial issue is consciousness. All else can be explained by the material world. Only consciousness is up for grabs. Is consciousness derived from accidental biology, as most scientists believe? Or is consciousness somehow fundamental in the cosmos? A philosopher who challenges conventional wisdom on this is David Chalmers.
What is there in the world? I think this is a really interesting question. I mean, the world does contain some stuff. It does contain some things, but is there an ultimate catalog of all the things that exist? You know, my hand, my shoe, my hair, this room, the number 2, the planet Venus. Could we draw up a list, an inventory of all the things that exist in the world? So I think there's got to be something wrong with that question. The world has a nature. What we're doing in science and philosophy is studying the nature of the world. Maybe it even has a fundamental nature. There's physics, and maybe there's consciousness, and who knows what there is at the fundamental level. And then there's any number of ways of carving this world up into entities. So my own view is there's not one privileged way of carving the world up into things.
But what about categories of things? Are there things we can distinguish from other things?
I think you can introduce all the categories you like. You know, if you want to talk about numbers, you can. If you want to talk about people, you can. You want to talk about sentences, you can. You want to talk about unicorns, or maybe you can't. So maybe there are some rules. But now the philosopher, like the mathematician, sure, there are numbers. Now the philosopher steps back and says, but are there really numbers? Do they really exist? Somehow that's the wrong question. You can do mathematics, you can say there are 4 prime numbers less than 10, without needing to bring in this further realm of the entities that exist absolutely and mind independently.
But you can define things that are made of particles. That's a category.
Yeah, the place I take these questions most seriously is at the fundamental level in, say, in physics. You know, it defines certain entities, some particles that you need for physics. Maybe those things exist fundamentally. Anything above that, I think, is bookkeeping.
So what are you saying? You're saying there's only one thing and it's the universe, and that we in our maybe very limited mental capacity are slicing it in odd ways when it's unsliceable?
You know, there's just totally different perspectives on the world. So here's one perspective. There's one universe and everything else is just slices of it. Here's another perspective. There's a zillion particles in the world and everything, including the whole universe, is built up from that. What I'm saying is both of those perspectives are equally right and equally wrong. There's no choosing between them. There's just stuff. That's what the world is.
The reason why I have sensed that this question is important is that it may enable us to see things that we haven't seen before, to visualize the sense of reality in a different way than what we're commonly perceived to do.
So, for example,
if physical reality is one thing, if abstract objects are something else, if consciousness is a third thing, maybe there's a spiritual world where gods live and angels and demons. I mean, people think that, so at least I got to address it. So now I can conceptualize 4 or 5 different big categories. Now maybe this whole thing is nonsense.
Multiple aspects of reality. I think it's a good way to think about it. Yeah, there's the physical aspect and the mental aspect, and perhaps the abstract, the mathematical aspect. And then we can ask, how do all these aspects of reality relate to each other? Which is the most fundamental? That's a really fascinating question to ask. What are the fundamental aspects of reality? I'm just not sure we need to divide the world into things to do that.
What's all reality? It depends on one's worldview. All is material, even if impossible to understand. Souls and spirits are the real realm. God exists and the Bible is true. Our universe may be a simulation. Consciousness is key. How do I categorize all reality? 2 big categories: physical and non-physical, or material and immaterial. But does the non-physical or the immaterial actually exist? The key, indeed, is consciousness. Is the mind just the brain? If so, then only the physical is real. Or is the mental beyond the brain? If so, then the non-physical is also real. Western religions would have the mental as coming from God, God being the primary category. Eastern religions would have the mental itself as the primary category, without any need for God. If I am forced to choose, I'd go with Freeman Dyson.
I think it's quite likely that the universe has some sort of a mental apparatus, which you can call God if you like, and it has a mental aspect as well as a physical aspect. And within the mental apparatus, whatever it may be, there can be a purpose. So in some sense, the universe has a mind of its own.
For me, for now, a mental apparatus is closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.